The braiding room over the malt house in South Street was so cold that morning that the water in the jug had a skin of ice on it, and Damaris Frampton had been working since 6:15 by the light of one tallow candle and whatever the sky would give her. She sat on a 3-legged stool with the net hung on its hook above her head, and the meshboard in her left hand, and the braiding needle in her right, and her hands moved the way other people breathe. Over, round, through, draw, over, round, through, draw. 400 meshes to the score, and the score paid at 3 halfpence. And a woman who was quick and did not stop could make 1 shilling and 3pence in a long day, and go home with her fingers too stiff to unhook her own gown. Damaris was quicker than that. She had been braiding since she was 6 years old, sitting on a box at her mother's knee with a child's needle. And there was not a woman in Bridport, and there were 700 of them in that town and the villages about it, who could put up a herring net faster or truer. The other thing about her hands was harder to explain, and she had learned young not to try. She could feel a yarn. Not the way anybody can feel a yarn, running it through the fingers and saying it is coarse or fine. She could take a length of 2.5-pound hemp yarn between the ball of her thumb and the side of her forefinger and roll it once, and tell you how many turns to the foot the spinner had put into it, and whether he had put them in evenly or let his walk go slack in the last 20 fathom, and whether the hemp had been dressed at Netherbury or come off a Baltic ship, and whether it had been out in the wet before it was tarred. It was not a trick, and it was not second sight. It was only that she had put 10 million yards of yarn through those 2 fingers before she was 15. And somewhere in those years the yarn had stopped being a thing she touched and started being a thing she read. Her father had known it. Her great-uncle had known it. Nobody else had ever asked. At 7:30, Mrs. Tabitha Gollop came up the ladder with the day's hanks on her arm and stood a moment blowing on her knuckles. She was 60, and she had braided all her life, and she was the nearest thing the room had to a foreman, and she looked at the net over Damaris's head and then at the 4 other women coming in behind her, with their shawls over their heads. "That's never last night's," said Mrs. Gollop. "It is," said Damaris. "You'll do yourself a mischief." "I've done myself a mischief already," said Damaris, "and it's called being warm in February, and I can't afford it." The other women laughed, because it was the kind of joke that was allowed, and they hung their nets and settled, and the room filled with the small, dry, endless sound of 5 needles going, which is a sound like rain beginning, and which anybody who has ever lived in that town will hear in their sleep until they die. Damaris Frampton was 24 that winter. She was slight and straight in the back, from a lifetime of sitting to a net, a little above the middle height, with heavy dark blonde hair, the exact color of dressed hemp, which she braided and pinned in a low crown because it kept out of the work, and wide-set hazel-brown eyes, and a pale, square-jawed face with a scatter of freckles over the nose that 11 years of indoor work had not been able to take off her. Her mother was 9 years dead of a fever. Her father was 4 years dead of the hemp cough, which is what that town called what the dust does to a man who dresses hemp for 30 years in a shed with the doors shut. Her elder sister Prudence had married Mrs. Ambrose Whittle of the Mead Works in 1814, and had a house with a brass knocker and 2 servants and a carriageway. and did not come to South Street. That was the whole of Damaris Frampton's account with the world, and if she had died that February, the account would have closed at 9 shillings and 4 pence, which was what she had in a tin under the floorboard, and a garnet cross of her mother's, and a mesh board her father had cut for her, out of a piece of Spanish mahogany, off a wreck. At 9 o'clock, a boy came up the ladder without knocking and stood dripping on the boards. "Miss Frampton," he said, "you're to come." He's asking. She did not ask who. There was only one he in her life who could send for her. She put the needle in the mesh and took her shawl off the nail, and Mrs. Gollop said she would see to the net, and Damaris went down the ladder and out into the street. It had been raining since Christmas. That is not a manner of speaking. It had rained on the 3rd of January, and on every day but 4 since, and the Brit was up over the meadows below the town, and there was standing water in the lane by the priory ground. And the whole of the west country lay under a low grey lid that had not lifted in 6 weeks. She went up North Street with her shawl over her head, past the ropers' cottages with the doors shut and no smoke worth the name coming out of them, past the shut yard of Tucker's Walk that had shut in 1816, past the row of little narrow gardens between the houses that are not gardens at all, but the ends of old rope walks, which is why to this day the plots behind those houses run back from the street 400 feet and are 12 feet wide. At the top of the town she turned in at the gate of Spittal Walk. There is a thing that happens to a person coming through the gate of a rope walk who has known it from childhood, and it happened to her that morning as it always did, and it never once stopped happening for the rest of her life. The gate gives on to a yard, and the yard is nothing much. A hemp store with a stone floor, a dressing shed, a tar house black to the eaves, a little counting house with 3 steps up to the door. And then, going away from you, straight as a gun barrel and level as a table, under a roof of tarred board on posts with the sides open to the weather, is the walk itself. 240 fathom of it. A quarter of a mile and a little over. You stand at the tackleboard end and you look down it, and the posts go away from you and get smaller and closer together until they run into one another. And at the far end, a quarter of a mile off, there is a small, bright doorway of daylight, the size of a playing card. Her great-uncle used to say that a man who is not moved by the sight of his own walk on a wet morning has no business in the trade. Barnaby Frampton was 79 years old, and he had spun his first yarn on that walk in the year 1749, at 11 years of age, on the day his father let him go the length for the first time. He had been master of it since 1777. He had made cordage for the Navy Board under contract from 1793 to the peace, and for the Newfoundland trade, and for the Portland quarries, and for every fisherman between Lyme and Abbotsbury. And there were 61 men in that yard in the year 1809, and in February of 1817 there were 4. She found him in the room over the counting house where he had slept for 51 years. 2 men of the walk were on the stairs, holding their hats. Zebedee Loader, who dressed the hemp and was 68 and had a bad chest, and young Reuben Slade, who was 19 and had been the last apprentice bound in the good years, and had nothing now to be apprenticed to. "He's been asking since 3, said Zeb. "He won't have the doctor." She went in. The old man was propped up on a bolster with his face turned to the little window that looked down the length of the walk because he had cut that window himself in 1790, so that he could lie in his bed and see whether his spinners were keeping their pace. He was a very small old man by then, and his hands on the coverlet were brown and swollen at the joints, and shining where 50 years of tar had gone into the skin and stayed there. "Damaris," he said. "Good, shut the door. I want the smell of the tar house and not the smell of the stairs." She sat down on the edge of the bed and took his hand. "Is the doctor to come, Uncle?" "The doctor," said Barnaby Frampton, "may come on Thursday and look at me then and tell them all what they want to hear. Listen to me. There's a thing I have to say, and I have been 3 days getting the wind for it." "Say it then." He did not say it. He said, instead, "What's the weather?" "Rain, wind, so west," she said. "Freshening. There's a bank of it coming up over Ipe." He nodded, very slowly, the way old men do when a thing has been confirmed that they have known for 60 years. "Now," he said, "take my hand and shut your eyes and walk it with me." From the tackle board. She shut her eyes. It was a game they had played when she was 7. He had made her walk the length of that walk with a cloth over her eyes hundreds of times, counting her paces aloud, until she could tell you where she was on it, to within a yard by the sound the roof made over her head. "The tackle board," she said. "The 4 hooks. The whirls. Then the first bay, and the tar drips on the 3rd post because the roof's short there. Then the crooked post you never mended." "Never mended," he agreed. "Then 80 fathom on, the ground rises the width of a hand, and you can feel it in your knees going up and not coming down. Then the west door where the wind cuts across. Then the long dry stretch where the swallows build. Then the sledge track worn in the ground where the traveler runs. Then the far door." "Good," he said. "Good, that's yours now. All of it." She opened her eyes. "Uncle, Hoskin has it written and sealed since my Kelmis," said Barnaby Frampton. "The walk, the ground, the store, the tar house, the counting house, the loft over it, the tools, the tackle, the whirls, the tops, the patterns, and the books. Every book. You hear me. Especially the books." Damaris said nothing at all for a while. "There'll be trouble," she said at last. "There will be considerable trouble," said the old man, with a good deal of satisfaction. "Now attend, because this is the part I have been saving my wind for. In the hank loft over the counting house, there is a peg for every contract this walk has taken since my father's time. There's a sample hank hanging on every peg with a tally on it. There's 171 of them. And in the great book on the shelf under them there's an entry against every one, in my hand and my father's, saying the hemp and the spinner and the tar and the lay and the day it went out of the gate. I know it," she said. "I've dusted them since I was 8. "You have not looked at them," said Barnaby. "You've dusted them. There's a difference, and it will one day be worth a great deal of money to you. Now, take one down. Any one. Unlay it. What do you find in the heart of the middle strand?" She thought. "The red yarn," she said. "The red yarn," said the old man. "Scarlet worsted," said Damaris. "One thread of it, laid in the heart of the middle strand, from end to end. It's been in every rope out of this gate since before I was born, and I never once thought to ask why, because it was always there, the same as the crooked post." Barnaby Frampton laughed, and it hurt him, and he stopped. "My father put it in," he said, "in 1776. Because a pool man was selling bad 3-inch under our name to the Newfoundland ships, and we could not prove it. It is in every fathom this walk has ever made. It is entered in the rope house books at Plymouth Dock against the name of this walk. because the Navy Board required a maker's mark of every contractor, and that is the mark I gave them. There is one man living at the dock, and his name is Cobb, who could stand up in any court in England and swear to it. Write that name down. Cobb. I'll remember it. Write it down, said the old man sharply. Memory is a very fine thing, girl, but paper is a witness. So she got up and found the stub of pencil and the back of a tally slip, and wrote the name down while he watched her do it. And then he was quiet for a while, and she thought he had gone to sleep. Then he said, without opening his eyes, Damaris, when they laugh at you, and they will laugh at you before the month is out, do not answer them. Not one word. Let them go on laughing until you have the thing in your hand, and then put it on the table where everybody can see it, and let it speak. She said she would try. You will not try, he said. You will do it. You are the only one of the whole lot of us that was born with the hands, and I have watched you sit in a cold room over a malt house for 11 years braiding herring nets at 3 halfpence the score with those hands, and I have not been able to sleep for it since your father died. Barnaby Frampton died at 20 minutes past 4 that afternoon, with the window open and the wind coming up the length of the walk. And the last thing he said was a count. He was counting a spinner down the walk. He got to 62 and stopped. They buried him on the 7th of February in the churchyard of St. Mary at the bottom of the town, in rain so heavy that the clergyman's book came apart in his hands, and the Reverend Miss Yeatman had to finish it from memory, which he did very well. Every rope maker in Bridport came. Every one. The trade was on its knees that winter. The Navy had stopped buying at the piece, and half the walks in the town were grass. And they came all the same, in their black coats that were mostly borrowed, and stood 4 deep round that grave in the rain, because Barnaby Frampton had been the best of them for 40 years, and everybody knew it. Damaris stood at the head of the grave in her mother's black gown, with the sleeves let down twice. On the far side of the grave, under an umbrella held by a clerk, stood Mr. Ambrose Whittle of the Mead Works, with her sister Prudence on his arm. Ambrose Whittle was 36 that year, and prospering, and very nearly the only man in the town who was. He was tall and heavy in the shoulder, dark-haired, with a long, clean-shaven face, and small pale eyes and a thin mouth, and he wore that day a plum-coloured tailcoat that had cost 11 guineas, and a yellow Marcella waistcoat, and a collar starched so high he had to turn his whole body to look at a thing beside him. His father had been a hemp factor. Ambrose had gone into nets and prospered at nets, and he had 40 braiders and 11 men and a counting house and a drying ground on Coward's Mead in the bottom below Spittle Walk. And everybody in the town knew what he was waiting for, and everybody in the town assumed he would get it, because there was nobody else. He was very civil at the graveside. He shook the men's hands. He said the trade had lost its father. It was afterwards in the parlor of the Greyhound, where the funeral company had its bread and cheese and its glass of hot, that he said the other thing. He did not say it to her. That was the point of it. He said it to Mr. Pittard, the insurance agent, and to 2 of the Beaminster men, with his back half turned to her and his voice at exactly the pitch of a man who does not much care who hears him, and the room being what it was, everybody heard him. He said, "I am very sorry for the old gentleman, but I will tell you plainly what has happened, because you will all know it by Tuesday. He has left the walk to the girl. Somebody said something. To the braider, said Ambrose Whittle. Yes. 24 years old, and cannot spin a yarn, nor tar a strand, nor lay a fathom of anything, and he has left her 1/4 of a mile of grass, and a shed with a hole in the roof, and £300 of debt on the hemp store to go with it. It is a cruelty, is what it is. I shall have to be a brother to her over it. Grass and a shed, gentlemen, in the year 1817, when there is not a navy contract to be had in England, and Old Tucker's Walk is let for a rope house of eels. Grass and a shed. And her sister Prudence, who was 28 and had been braiding beside her in that room over the malt house until she was 19, and who knew perfectly well what her sister's hands were, stood beside him with her gloves in her hand and looked at the fire and said nothing. Damaris Frampton put down her glass, which she had not touched, and went out through the yard door into the rain, and walked up North Street, and let herself in at the gate of her 1/4 of a mile of grass, and stood under the roof at the tackle-board end, and looked down the length of it, all the way to the small bright doorway of daylight, the size of a playing card. Do not answer them, the old man had said. Not one word. She stood there for a very long time. The will was read on the 11th of February in the front room of Mr. Hoskins' office in East Street, a room with a coal fire and a wall of japanned deed boxes, and a smell of dust and sealing wax that she never afterwards could smell without her heart going hard and quick. Mr. Hoskin was 55 and stout and red, faced with white side whiskers and a way of reading a document as though he were daring it to try anything. Damaris sat on a hard chair with her bonnet in her lap. Prudence sat by the window. Ambrose Whittle stood with his back to the fire and his coat tails apart, which is a thing a man does in a room he expects shortly to own. It did not take long. The whole of the freehold known as Spittal Walk, with the yard, the hemp store, the dressing shed, the tar house, the counting house and the loft over the same, the rope walk of 240 fathom and the ground whereon it stands, together with all tackle, tops, whirls, patterns, gear and stock in trade, and all books, ledgers, day books, sample hanks and papers whatsoever, unto his great niece Damaris Frampton absolutely. To his niece Prudence Whittle, £20 and a tall clock. To Ambrose Whittle 1 shilling and a coil of 3-inch line, which the testator directed should be delivered to him in person and without explanation. There was a silence in that room of about 4 seconds, which is a long time. Then Ambrose Whittle laughed. It was a good laugh, he did it well. He had the sense to make it sound generous. A coil of line, he said. Well, the old gentleman kept his humour to the end. Hoskin, what is the state of the estate? Mr. Hoskin looked at his papers. There is £340 charged on the hemp store, he said, to Mr. Sprake of Beaminster, at 5 per centum, and it falls in at midsummer. There is £81 owing to the tar merchant at Poole. There is a half-year's rates. There is, against that, the stock in the store, which is 9 tons of hemp, mostly Petersburg clean, and the gear, and the goodwill of such contracts as remain. And what contracts remain? None, said Mr. Hoskin, that are worth a shilling. Ambrose Whittle turned round and looked at Damaris for the first time that morning, and his face was full of nothing but kindness, and that was the worst of it. My dear sister, he said, you have been left a very great burden, by a very old man who loved you and was past knowing what he did. I will not have you ruined for it. I will give you £80 for the freehold as it stands, and I will take the debt on my own back, and there is a place in my braiding shed at Coward's Mead for you at 8 shillings the week the day you want it. And my house is your house, and nobody in this town will ever hear from me that you could not carry it. Come, it is grass and a shed, my dear. Let it go. Damaris Frampton sat quite still on the hard chair with her bonnet in her lap. Do not answer them. Thank you, she said. Mr. Hoskin, will you have the keys sent up to me this afternoon, and the great book off the shelf in the loft brought down to your safe until I ask for it? I have work to do. And she put on her bonnet and went out. She slept that night in the room over the counting house, in the bed the old man had died in, with the window open because she could not bear it shut, and she woke at 5 out of habit and lay there in the dark, listening to the rain on the tarred boards of the roof of her own rope walk, and understood for the first time in her life what it is to be frightened of a thing you have wanted. At first light she took the lantern and went up the ladder into the hank loft. It ran the whole length over the counting house and the store, low under the slope of the roof, and it was warm and dry because the tar house chimney went up through the end of it, which was the reason Barnaby's father had chosen it. Along both sides, on oak pegs driven into the purlins a foot apart, hung the hanks. A hank is a coil of finished rope, a fathom or two of it, laid up in a neat figure of 8, and seized at the middle. Each of these had a flat pear-shaped tally of beechwood on a string at its seizing, and on every tally in a small dry hand was a number. She had dusted them for 16 years. She had never once counted them. She counted them now, going down one side, with the lantern held up and her breath showing, and there were 88 on the north side and 83 on the south, and the numbers ran from 1 to 171 with none missing, and the oldest of them was black and stiff as a boot and smelled of nothing at all, and the newest was still faintly sweet with Stockholm tar. The great book lay on the shelf under the pegs. It was a folio in brown calf with a strap, and it was 4 inches thick, and she took it down and sat on the floor of the loft with her back against the chimney and opened it on her knees. The first entry was in a hand she had never seen, brown and crabbed and beautiful, and it was dated the 9th of April, 1777. Number 1. 3-inch hawser laid, 60 fathom, for Mist Bartlett of Burton, hemp Petersburg clean, dressed loader, spun Frampton and Hallett, tarred light, lay 11-inch, red yarn in heart of middle strand. Sample hank hung. She turned the pages. The hand changed in 1798 from the fathers to the sons. The entries went on. Cable for the harbour commissioners, warps for the Newfoundland ships out of Poole, 600 fathom of 2.5 for the Portland quarry cranes, the whole of it double tarred, God help them, and a note in the margin in Barnaby's hand, they will not have it double tarred again, they say it costs. Signal halyards for the Coast Guard, 1.5 tons of white line for the mackerel boats at Burton Bradstock, Navy contracts, page after page of them, from 93 to 15, with the yard mark and the survey and the name of the officer who passed it. And against every single entry, in every year in both hands, the same 5 words at the end of the line, as regular as a heartbeat. Red yarn in heart of middle strand. Damaris sat on the floor of that loft until the light came up grey, in the little window at the end. And then she went down the ladder and out into the yard and stood in the wet, with her hands hanging at her sides, and looked at the walk. There were 4 men on the books: Zebedee Lauder, 68, hemp dresser, who had a chest full of 40 years of hemp dust, and could still hackle a stone of toe finer than any man in Dorset. Israel Purchase, 41, spinner, a silent man with a lame hip from a wagon that had gone over him in 1805, married with 6 children. Walter Chubb, 55, terror, who ran the copper in the tar house, and had a beard singed brown at one side, and had once been drunk for 11 days after his wife died, and never touched it since. And Reuben Slade, 19, apprentice, bound in 1813 when there had been 40 men in that yard, and who had spent the last 2 years sweeping and running errands and holding the far end of things. They were all 4 of them standing in the yard at 7 when she came out, in the rain, with their hats on and their hands in their pockets, waiting to be told they were done. Damaris looked at them. "I have £340 charged on the store," she said, "and 81 owing at pool, and 9 ton of hemp, and no contracts. I can pay you to the end of March out of what's in the box and no further. That's the truth, and you may have it in front of you instead of behind you." Nobody said anything. "Mr. Loder," she said, "how much of that Petersburg is fit?" "All of it," said Zeb. "He bought it in 14, and it's been dry. It's better now than it was then. Mr. Purchase, if I put you on the walk on Monday, could you spin 2.5 pound yarn to 11 turns and hold it the length?" Israel Purchase looked at her with a certain expression that she was to see on a good many faces in the next 12-month, which is the expression of a man who has just been asked a question by somebody he did not think knew there was a question. "I could," he said. "Mr. Chubb, what's in the copper?" "Half a ton of Stockholm and 1/4 of Archangel, and the Archangel's no good to man nor beast." "Then we shall not use the Archangel," she said. "Reuben, get up on that roof this morning and find me every place the wet comes in between the tackle board and the west door, and mark them with chalk, and do not fall off it, because I cannot afford a doctor, and your mother would have my life." Then she said, "I do not know how to spin, and I do not know how to tar, and I have never laid a rope in my life. You 4 know all of it. What I know is the books, and what I have is these," and she held up her 2 hands. "And there is not a yarn goes out of this gate that I shall not have had through my fingers first. That is what I bring. If it is not enough for you, there is no shame in it, and Mr. Whittle is taking men on at the mead for 9 shillings. Walter Chubb spat carefully into the mud, well away from anybody's boots. "Whittle," he said, "put a man of mine on white line last May that was spun 8 turns and sold it for 11. And when I told him of it, he told me to mind my copper." "I'll stop." Zeb Loder said he had been in that yard since 1766, and he did not intend to learn a new gait at 68. Israel Purchase said nothing at all, and went and got the whirls out of the store, which was his way of saying it. Reuben Slade went and got the ladder. They had 11 days like that, working on nothing, mending. She had the roof stopped in 19 places. She had the walk swept its whole length, and the sledge track dug out and leveled where the winter had gullied it. She had the tar house scoured, and the copper set, and the Archangel tar drummed off, and sold at a loss to a man who wanted it for a barn roof. She went through the store hank by hank, and bale by bale with her hands, and had Zeb open every bale of the Petersburg to the light, and there was a bale and a half of it that had taken wet at some time in a corner under the north wall, and she had it carried out and burnt in the yard, and the men watched her burn 11 pounds worth of hemp and did not say a word, and Zeb Loder told his wife that night that the old man had known what he was about after all. On the 22nd of February, a man came up from the town in a drab coat. His name was Snell, and he was Mr. Whittle's clerk, and he had a way of coming into a yard sideways, and he stood in the counting-house doorway, turning his hat round in his hands, and said that Mr. Whittle had been thinking of the old gentleman, and grieving for him, and had a fancy to have something of his by him for a keepsake, being family. Dummery said Mr. Whittle was very welcome to the tall clock, which was Prudence's in any case. Not the clock, said Snell. The old books, the day books and the tally slips and the sample hanks and such. Mr. Whittle said, being a man of the trade himself, he'd sooner they went to somebody that valued them than to the chandler for waste. He'd give £5 for the lot as it stands in the loft. 6, if you'd throw in the big brown one on the shelf. There was a small silence in the counting-house. £6, said Damaris. £6, said Snell, and it's above the value, and he knows it, and he don't care. She had £11 and some shillings in the box in front of her at that moment, and a wage bill of £2.14 every Saturday. Tell Mr. Whittle, she said, that they are not for sale. Snell put his hat on. Miss Frampton, he said, I'd take it, if I was you. It ain't going to be 6 next time. And he went away down the lane, and Damaris Frampton sat looking at the door for a long while after he had gone, and then she went up the ladder into the loft, and stood among the hanks with the lantern, and looked at them hanging there in 2 long rows going away into the dark under the roof. 171 of them, black and brown and grey, and here and there the dull, sweet gleam of new tar, and she thought about a man who would pay £6 for a loft full of old rope in a year when he was beating his own braiders down a farthing the score. Do not answer them, the old man had said. Let them go on laughing, until you have the thing in your hand. She did not know yet what the thing was, but she knew from that afternoon that somebody else in that town thought it was worth £6 to have it in the fire. The man came on, the last day of February, in the evening, walking. She was in the yard shutting the store, when she heard boots on the lane, which was unusual, because nobody walked up to Spittlewalk after dark that winter, there being nothing at the top of the lane but the walk and the hill. She took the lantern to the gate. He was standing on the other side of it, with his hat in his hand, and he was a very big man. He was 32 or thereabouts, 6'1", broad through the shoulder and thick through the wrist, with dark brown hair cropped short and pushed back off a high forehead, and a short dark beard trimmed close along the jaw, and deep-set dark blue eyes, and skin browned and roughened by 15 years of weather. He had a seaman's canvas bag over one shoulder. He wore a coarse oatmeal linen shirt, open at the throat under a plain dark jacket, and dark blue duck trousers and heavy shoes, and his hands, when he moved them, were stained a deep, permanent brown from the nail to the wrist, in the way that only tar does, and there was a hard white line of old scar across the palm, and the roots of the fingers of the right one. She knew the hands before he opened his mouth. "Good evening," he said. "Is the master about?" "Aye," am the master," said Damaris. He looked at her. He did not laugh, and he did not do the thing with his eyebrows that half the town had been doing for 3 weeks, and he did not say anything gallant. He simply took that in, the way a man takes in a change of wind, and adjusted. "Then I ask your pardon," he said. "My name is Gideon Trescott. I was master rope maker in the King's Rope House at Plymouth Dock, and I was discharged on the 14th of January, along with 160 other men, the war being over, and the Navy having more cable in store than it can rot in 20 years. I am walking to Bristol. I heard in Bridport this afternoon that Frampton's Walk was lighting its copper again, which is more than any other walk between here and Exeter is doing, and I have come up to ask for a week's work, and I will take it in bread if there's no money." Damaris held the lantern up a little. "Plymouth Dock," she said. 11 years. Master rope maker. Since 1813. Before that, foreman of the laying floor. Then you can lay a cable." "I can lay a 22-inch cable," said Gideon Trescott, "of 3,096 yards in a house 900 feet long, with 80 men on the crank and 4 horses, and I have done it 40 times, and I can tell you what every one of those men will do wrong before he does it." He stopped. "And I can also," he said, "spin, dress, hackle, tar, warp, form, harden, serve, splice, and I can strop a block, and I can make a mat, and I would rather do any of it in a covered walk in Dorset than go to Bristol and beg a place in a sugar house, which is what I shall be doing on Tuesday." Damaris opened the gate. "Come in, Mr. Trescott," she said. "There is nobody in the counting house, and there is a fire in it, and there is bread and cheese, and there is a bed of sorts in the loft over the tar house. And I will tell you the truth about the money, because you will find it out on Saturday anyway." He came in and she shut the gate. Halfway across the yard he stopped and turned and looked down the length of the walk, which was black under its roof with the last of the light at the far end of it, and he stood there for a good while. "Well," he said at last. "Well, what?" "That," said Gideon Trescott, "is a very fine piece of work. Whoever laid that ground laid it true. Look how the posts run. That's not been thrown up by a builder, that's been surveyed. And it's roofed the whole length, which not one walk in 6 is. And it's roofed high enough for the tar not to drip in summer, which not 1 in 20 is. It was laid out in 1744, said Damaris, by my great-great-grandfather, who took the levels himself with a spirit level and a plank, because he did not trust the man from Dorchester. He did right not to, said Gideon. They stood there a moment longer in the wet dark. How long is it? He asked. 240 fathom. He whistled. You could lay a cable of 110 fathom on that, he said, finished, with the shrinkage. There's not a merchant walk west of Portsmouth can say it. I know, said Damaris Frampton. That is the whole of my fortune. I have 1/4 mile of grass and a shed with a hole in the roof, and 9 ton of hemp, and 4 men, and 340 pound of debt falling in at midsummer. And if you will come in out of the rain, I will show you the books, because I would like somebody in this yard besides me to know exactly how bad it is. Gideon Trescott put his bag down on the counting-house step. Miss Frampton, he said, I have been in the trade since I was 13 years of age, and I have never once in my life been shown the books. Then it will be a novelty for us both, she said, and went in ahead of him with the lantern. They sat over the books until past 11 with the fire going down, and she laid it all out for him. The mortgage, the tar bill, the rates, the £11 in the box, the 9 tons of hemp, the 4 men, and the fact that on the 9th of April, if nothing changed, she would have to write to Mr. Sprake of Beaminster and tell him she could not find the interest. Gideon Trescott listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, which she noticed, because no man had ever done it before. Then he said, what did the old gentleman make his money at? Cordage for the Navy Board, mostly, from 93 to 15. Cable and hawsers. Then it stopped. It stopped everywhere, said Gideon. What else? Quarry ropes for Portland. Mooring warps for the harbor below. Whale line once, for a Hull ship that came in for shelter and never came again. Herring warps, mackerel line, seine rope, buoy rope. And nets, but the nets went away from us to Whittle 20 years ago because he had the Braders' cottages and my uncle wouldn't build any. Whittle, said Gideon. That's the plum coat I passed on the road. That's the plum coat. Gideon turned the great book round on the table and went slowly backwards through it with one brown finger, and stopped and read for a while, and turned back further and read again. Here's a thing, he said. 1806. 200 fathom of 6-inch cable laid for the Portland quarry cranes, and against it in the margin, refused double tarring, will not last 4 year, told them so. And here's 1810, same customer, same order, same note, and here's 12, and here's 14. And then, nothing. They went to a Weymouth man in 15, said Damaris. 3p the pound cheaper. Right, said Gideon. Now what is a quarry crane rope doing all day? Hanging in the wet, said Damaris, and lifting stone and rubbing on a sheave and being rained on and being frozen in January and baked in August. And what does that do to a rope that has been tarred light because the tar cost? It rots it in the heart where nobody can see, she said, and then it goes without warning in the middle of a lift. Gideon shut the book. Then that is where I would begin, he said. If the yard were mine and I had 9 ton of good Petersburg and a walk 1/4 of a mile long and no name left to lose. Because a Weymouth man selling 3p cheap has had 2 years now to kill somebody, and quarry masters have very long memories about killing. They looked at each other across the table. You said a week's work, said Damaris. I did, Mr. Trescott. I cannot pay you what a master rope maker of Plymouth Dock is worth. I cannot pay you what a spinner is worth. I can pay you 12 shillings the week and your bread and the loft over the tar house, and I can promise you that if I get out of this at all, you will have a share of it in writing. And if I do not get out of it, you will have wasted a summer. Gideon Trescott sat back and looked at the fire. In the King's Rope House, he said, there is a floor 1,000 feet long with a roof on it like a church, and there are 900 men in it, and I was master of it, and in 11 years not one of them ever asked me what I thought about anything. They asked me how many fathom and by when. He looked up. 12 shillings, he said, and the writing when there's something to write about. They began on the 3rd of March. The first thing he did was to make her spin. She had known she could not, and she had told him so, and he said that was not the point, and put a hackled bunch of hemp round her waist in a bight, and showed her how to draw the fibers out of it, with the left hand, while the right kept the yarn to the whirl, and how to walk backwards down the walk at the pace of a slow funeral, feeding out, never checking, never hurrying. She got 11 fathom before the yarn ran thin and parted. She got 9 the next time. On the fourth attempt, she got 30 fathom of something that would have shamed a child. Well, said Gideon, that is worse than Reuben's first, and Reuben was 14. I told you. You did. Now come and put your hands on this. He gave her the yarn Israel Purchase had spun that morning, and she rolled a foot of it between her thumb and finger, without looking at it, and said, 11 turns and a half to the foot for the first 60 fathom, and 11 flat after that, and there's a hard place about 110 fathom in where he took a breath. Gideon Trescott stood very still. Say that again, he said. She said it again. He went and got the register and the yarn and counted the turns with a pin 3 times at 3 places along its length, which took him the better part of half an hour, and then he came back and stood in the doorway of the counting house. 11 and a half, he said, and then 11 and a hard place at 108 fathom. I said 110. I'm not a surveyor. He came and sat down on the corner of the table, which was not a liberty he had taken before. Miss Frampton, he said, in the King's Rope House we have a machine for that, and it costs £40, and it is wrong more often than you were just now. I have had a great deal of yarn through these fingers, she said. How much? She thought about it seriously. If you braid 80 of herring mesh in a day, she said, and the twine runs about 1,100 yards to the score, and you do it 6 days in the week for 11 years less Sundays, and the weeks I was ill, it is something over 3 million fathom. So I have not the least idea, Mr. Trescott. But it is a good deal. Gideon Trescott began to laugh and could not stop for some time, and Israel Purchase looked up from the tackle board at the far end of the yard and saw the master rope maker of Plymouth Dock sitting on a table in the rainlight laughing until he had to wipe his eyes, and said afterwards that it was the first cheerful noise heard in that yard since Michaelmas. From that day the arrangement of the yard settled into what it was to be, and it was this. Gideon Trescott spun and formed and laid and taught, and swore at the tackle board, and mended the sledge, and did the work of 3 men without appearing to hurry. Israel Purchase spun and said nothing. Zeb Loader dressed, and hackled, and coughed. Walter Chubb kept the copper and the tar at a heat that Gideon said was the best he had seen out of the King's yards. Reuben Slade ran, fetched, held, learned, and grew 1.5 inches that spring. And every yarn made in that yard went through Damaris Frampton's hands before it went into a strand. Every one. She sat on a stool at the head of the walk, with a board across her knees and the hanks coming up from the spinners, and she ran a fathom of each through her thumb and finger, and either laid it to the right or laid it to the left, and the ones on the left went back to be spun again. In the first fortnight she sent back 1/3 of everything Israel Purchase made, and he did not speak to her for 4 days. In the 3rd week she sent back 6 hanks out of 90. In the 5th she sent back none at all, and Israel Purchase came into the counting house at the end of that Saturday and stood turning his hat over and said, "That's the best yarn I ever spun in my life, mistress, and I've been spinning 22 year. And I never knew till now that I'd been letting my hand go slack after the west door." "Everybody does," said Damaris. "My uncle used to say the west door has cost this trade more money than the French. She put the record of it in the great book in her own hand, under 171 entries in 2 dead men's hands, and it took her 20 minutes to make herself write the first line, and after that it came easier. They made line that spring, because line was what could be sold in small parcels for cash, and cash was what she needed by Saturday. White line for the mackerel boats. Buoy rope. Seine rope for the Seine cruise at Burton and Ype and Chesil. Cod line for the 2 pool ships, small stuff and hard won, and sold in tens of pounds and not hundreds. And it was too good, and that made trouble, which she had not expected. The mackerel men had been buying at Whittle's for 11 years because Whittle's was cheaper, and because Whittle's braiders made their nets and it was easier to have the one account. When Damaris Frampton's line began to appear on the beach at Chesil in April, there was first a great deal of amusement about it, and then a fortnight of silence, and then an old man named Hosea Legg, who had fished off that bank for 50 years, came up the lane to Spittlewalk with 16 fathom of it over his shoulder, and asked to see whoever was responsible. Damaris came out. "Did you make this?" he said. "My men made it. I passed the yarn." Hosea Legg dropped the coil on the cobbles. "I've had it a month," he said. "It's been wet every day of it, and dry twice. It ain't stretched. It ain't kinked. It ain't gone hard in the heart. I put a strain on it Tuesday would have broke the other stuff, and it never so much as squeaked. What do you tar it with?" "Stockholm," said Walter Chubb from the tar-house door, "at the heat it wants and not a degree over, and I don't run it twice because running it twice burns the heart out of the hemp, whatever they may tell you at the mead." Hosea Legg looked at the coil on the ground. "What do you want for it?" 7 pence 3 farthings the pound," said Damaris. He whistled. "Whittle's 6 pence ha'penny. I know. You'll not sell a fathom of it at that." "Mr. Legg," said Damaris Frampton, "I have 4 men, and I pay them, and I burn the hemp that has taken wet instead of putting it in the middle where it doesn't show, and I use tar that costs me £3 the ton more than the Archangel, and my line will be on your boat in 1820 when the other is at the bottom of the sea, and 7 pence 3 farthings is what it costs to do it that way. And if I sold it for 6 pence ha'penny, I should be selling you something else and calling it by the same name. That is my price. I shall not haggle it, and I shall not be offended if you go away." Hosea Legg picked up his coil and put it back on his shoulder and went away down the lane without another word, and Damaris went inside and sat down and put her face in her hands for about a minute and a half, and then got up and went back to the tackle board. On the Friday of that week 11 mackerel boats sent up to Spittlewalk for line, it was the beach that did it. Somebody had told somebody. By the end of May, she had the Seine cruise of 3 villages, and a standing order for buoy rope from the harbour. And a man from Lyme came over on a Sunday to look at the walk, and went away with 2 hundredweight and an argument he had lost. In June she paid Mr. Sprake his interest on the day it fell due, in cash, in his own office, in Beaminster, and walked home 11 miles, because the coach was 1 and 6 pence. That was the summer she learned the trade she had been born beside. She learned it in the evenings, mostly, after the men had gone, when the light lay all down the length of the walk in one long yellow bar from the west door, and the swallows came in under the roof and went out again at the far end. Gideon Trescott taught her the way he had been taught, which was to be shown a thing once, and then made to do it wrong 40 times. He taught her the warping of the yarn, and the forming of the strand, and the making of the top, the grooved wooden cone, hard as iron with age, that goes between the strands as they close so that they close together, and not one before another. He taught her that a rope is not made by twisting. A rope is made by 3 fights held in balance, the twist of the yarn against the twist of the strand against the twist of the lay, and that the whole art of it is to know, in your hands and your knees and the small of your back, when the 3 fights have come level. He taught her to read a rope by looking at the angle of the lay against a plumb line, and to read it better by putting her hands round it and letting the sledge take up. He said one evening, "What's the lay of that?" 11 inches, she said. 10 3/4. Feel again. She felt again. 10 3/4, she said. You said 11. I said 11, said Damaris, because I could not feel it and I did not want to say so in front of you, and that was a foolish thing to do, and I am ashamed of it, and it will not happen again. Gideon Trescott looked at her for a long moment down the length of that walk. There were 900 men at the dock, he said, and not 4 of them would have said that. He taught her, one very hot afternoon in July, to lay a 3-inch line herself, the whole of it, from the warping to the hardening, with Reuben on the sledge and Israel on the crank and Gideon standing behind her with his arms folded, saying nothing at all except once, near the end, when the strands began to run ahead of the top, and she felt it go wrong under her palms, and stopped everything dead, without being told to, and he said, quietly behind her, "That's it. That's the whole of the trade. Everything else is arithmetic." They took it off the hooks at 7 in the evening, 60 fathom of it, and it lay along the ground in the yellow light, with the twist standing perfectly even from end to end, and the 2 of them stood and looked at it. "It's not a bad piece of rope," said Gideon. "It is a beautiful piece of rope," said Damaris Frampton, "and I made it, and I am going to hang a fathom of it in the loft with a tally on it, and it is going to be number 172. Which she did that night, with the lantern, at 9:30, and wrote the entry in the great book below her uncle's last sample hank hung, "Red yarn in heart of middle strand." She did not know, when she wrote that line, that she was writing the sentence that would hang a man. The harbor lay 1.5 miles below the town at the mouth of the Brit, where the river comes out between 2 piers of oak and stone into the open bay, and it was a hard little harbor and always had been, because the shingle travels along that coast from the west and fills the mouth of it every winter, and the ships that use it are colliers and coasters, and the odd Newfoundland trader, and they come in on a rising tide with their hearts in their mouths. The Bridport Harbour Commissioners were 15 gentlemen who met 4 times a year in the upper room of the Bull in East Street, and they were responsible for the piers, the dredging, the moorings, the warping capstans, the buoys, and since the great gale of 1808, for the shore crew. The shore crew was 11 men, and a wagon, and a shed, and what was in the shed was rope. It had been put there in 1808, after a Sunderland brig went ashore on the shingle 300 yards from the pierhead, in daylight, in front of 200 people, and the whole of her company was lost within a stone's throw of dry land, because there was no line on that beach long enough or strong enough to get to her. The town had never got over it, so there was a shed at the pier root now, with 4 coils in it, 2 of 2.5 inch, 1 of 4 inch, and 1 great coil of 200 fathom of 5 inch, and a grapnel, and a hand mortar that nobody had ever fired in anger, and every man in the town knew what that shed was for. And in the standing orders of the commissioners, written in 1808, by a Captain Rendell who was still their harbour master 9 years later, there was an article which read, that all cordage supplied to the commissioners for the shore crew, the moorings, and the warping gear shall be of the making of a rope walk holding, or having heretofore held, His Majesty's contract for cordage, and shall be delivered with the maker's mark. There was one walk within 22 miles that could answer that description in the year 1817, and it was Spittal Walk. The tender was advertised in the last week of July, for delivery by the 1st of October, renewal of the 2 warping hawsers, 90 fathom of 6-inch, and renewal of the whole of the shore crew's gear, which was 200 fathom of 5-inch cable laid, and 120 of 4, and 2 coils of 2.5. Damaris Frampton and Gideon Trescott spent 3 evenings over it, with the great book open at the entries, for 1808, when Barnaby had made the last lot. It is 460 pound of work, said Gideon, and 11 weeks of the war, and the hemp is 190 of it. And it clears Sprake at midsummer next, said Damaris, and it puts 2 more men on, and it puts our mark back in the harbour where every ship that comes in can see it. Then tender at 490, said Gideon, and don't shave it, because you'll want the whole of that. She tendered at 490 pounds and delivered the paper to the clerk of the commissioners herself on the 2nd of August. Mr. Ambrose Whittle tendered at 380. She heard it from Reuben Slade, who had it from a boy at the Bull on the evening of the 11th of August, and she went up to the loft and sat down on the floor among the hanks and did not come down for 2 hours. Gideon Trescott was waiting in the yard when she did. He cannot do it, she said. It is not possible. The hemp alone is 190 pound, if it is Petersburg, and 140 if it is the worst Riga Rhine that ever came out of a ship, and he has no walk. He has a drying ground and a braiding shed, and a tar house and 40 women. He has no walk, Mr. Trescott. You cannot lay a 200 fathom cable on a drying ground. He has a walk somewhere, said Gideon. He has a half share in Tucker's, said Damaris slowly, that shut in 16. It is 110 fathom, and the roof is off 2 bays of it. He put a man in it in the spring to make halter rope and cheap seine. Then that is where it will be made. And the article, said Damaris. The article. He has never held a navy contract in his life. His father was a hemp factor. He cannot answer the article, and he knows it. And Captain Rendell knows it, because Captain Rendell wrote it. Gideon Trescott looked down the length of the walk for a while. Miss Frampton, he said, when a man tenders 110 pound under the cost of the work, he is not selling rope. He is buying something. Go down and ask them. She went down on the 14th of August and walked the 1.5 miles in the heat with her bonnet in her hand for the last of it, and found Captain Rendell in his little office at the pier root with the window open and the shingle grinding outside. He was 70 and dry and very courteous, and he had been at sea from 9 years old to 45. Miss Frampton, he said, sit down. I am sorry. I have come to ask about the article, said Damaris. Captain Rendell took a paper off a nail and gave it to her. That is Mr. Whittle's tender, he said, and there is his answer to the article at the foot of it, and I will thank you to read it aloud, because I have read it 11 times myself, and I want to hear how it sounds in somebody else's mouth. Damaris, read it aloud, the cordage to be supplied under this tender to be wholly of the making of the walk of the late Mr. Barnaby Frampton at Spittal, Bridport, being a walk which has heretofore held His Majesty's contract, and to be delivered with the mark of the said walk, the undersigned having the buying of the same. She read it twice more to herself. He has not said he makes it, she said. He has not, said Captain Rendell. He has said he buys it. From me. He has said he buys it from your walk, said the old man, which is not quite the same as saying he has bought it from you, though it will read the same to 12 gentlemen in a hurry on a Thursday afternoon. Miss Frampton, I put it to the board on Tuesday that we ought to have it under his hand that the order has been placed with you before we accept, and I was told by Mr. Whittle himself in the room that his sister-in-law's yard was hard-pressed for cash, and that he would not embarrass you by making the arrangement public, and that he was doing it for your sake. And I was told by 4 gentlemen who owe him money that they were satisfied. He has placed no order with me, said Damaris. He has not written to me. He has not sent to me. His clerk has been up my lane twice this year, and both times it was to buy the old books out of my loft. Captain Rendell folded his hands. Then you had better watch that harbour, he said, and I had better watch it with you, and we had neither of us better say a word we cannot prove, because he has the board and we have not. He did, in the event, send to her. That was the cleverest thing he ever did, and she did not see the whole of it until March. On the 28th of August Mr. Snell came up the lane again in his drab coat, and bought for cash 30 fathom of 5-inch cable laid rope at full price, £24, and made no complaint at all about the price, and took a receipt, and had it carted down to the Mead Works that afternoon. Damaris stood in the yard and watched the cart go, and had the feeling of a woman who has been paid for something and does not know what. Write it in the book, said Gideon. I have written it in the book. Write who took it and what he said and the day and the hour, said Gideon Trescott. Write it all. My master at the dock had a saying, the day you cannot see why a man is paying you, that is the day to keep a diary. The autumn came on. She had, by the end of September, 11 men and a boy on the books, and the walk running 6 days, and a name on that coast for line that could be trusted. And she had paid Poole in full, and she had £31 in the box. She had also, without ever having sat down and decided upon it, arrived at a state of affairs with her master rope-maker that was perfectly plain to every soul in that yard and to nobody at all in the counting-house. It was not spoken of. It was in the way he stood aside from the door. It was in the way she kept back the crust of the loaf, which he liked. It was in the fact that on the 12th of September, when she went to Beaminster to see Sprake, he walked the 11 miles there and the 11 miles back beside her, without ever once suggesting that he had a reason to, and in the fact that neither of them said anything much on either journey, and in the fact that Zeb Loder, who had eyes in his head, told his wife that night that there would be a wedding at Spittal Walk within 2 years, or he would eat his hackle. Once only it came near the surface. They were in the loft on a wet Sunday in October, cataloguing, because she had decided that the 172 hanks should each have a written description as well as a tally, and she was reading the entries out of the great book, and he was taking the hanks down and calling back what they were, and they had got as far as the year 1801. Number 64, she read. 2-inch 40 fathom, for the Reverend Mr. Chard of Simonsbury, for a well, 2-inch, said Gideon from the far end, 4-strand, white, not tarred, and it has been mouse-eaten at one end, and I shall put a bag round it. Number 65, 5-inch cable laid, 90 fathom, Harbour Commissioners, hemp Petersburg clean tarred full, lay 11, red yarn in heart of middle strand. She heard him unlaying it, the small dry crackle of an old rope opening. Here's your red yarn, he said. He came down the loft to her with a foot of scarlet worsted between his fingers, 16 years old, and still bright where the tar had kept it. Damaris took it and held it up to the little window. Why did they never tell anybody? She said. My uncle never once told a customer. It is not in a single letter. It is not in the tender. It is in the book, and it is in the rope, and it is nowhere else. Because it is not a decoration, said Gideon Trescott. It is a witness. You do not tell a witness what he is going to be asked. He was standing very close to her in the low part of the loft, under the slope, with his head bent, because he could not stand straight there, and the rain was on the roof, and the whole loft smelled of tar and dust and 40 years. She said, Mr. Trescott. He said, I know. Not yet, she said. No, he said. Not yet. There's Sprake at midsummer, and there's the winter to get through, and you have 11 men that eat. I am not going anywhere, Miss Frampton. I have been to Bristol, and they went back to the Hanks, and neither of them mentioned it again for 6 months, and both of them thought about it very nearly every day. The gale came out of the southwest on the night of the 19th of November, 1817. It had been blowing hard since the afternoon, and by 9 at night it was the worst wind on that coast since 1808, and the sea was coming over the West Pier in sheets, and the shingle was moving along the beach with a noise like a train of artillery. The sloop Mary Vi of Lyme, 71 tons, Master John Pomery, 6 hands and a boy, coal from Swansea for Bridport Harbour, had missed her tide at 6, and stood off to wait for water, and at 9:30 her cable parted, and she went on to the shingle 400 yards east of the pier, broadside, in the dark. The shore crew had her rockets at 20 minutes to 10. By 10, there were 300 people on that beach with lanterns, and the wagon was down, and the shed was open. Damaris Frampton was there. Everybody was there. In a town of that size, on a night of that kind, everybody is there. She had come down from the walk on the cart with Gideon and Reuben and Israel Purchase, and she stood in the wind with her shawl tied over her head and her skirts wrapped round her legs, and she watched them get the 4-inch line out of the wagon and bend it to the grapnel. The Mary Vi was lying over, with the seas breaking clean over her and her people up in the weather rigging, 7 of them, black against the white, 120 yards off the water's edge. They tried the mortar, and the line went 20 yards and blew back. They tried it again, and did no better. Then Gideon Trescott took his coat off. There were 4 men went into that water on the end of the 4-inch line, Gideon Trescott, and a Chazil man named Simeon Bragg, and Hosea Legg's grandson, and a lad of 18 from South Street named Job Gollop, who was Tabitha Gollop's grandson, and who had been braiding beside his grandmother in the room over the malt house 11 hours before, and who had gone down to the beach that night because everybody went. They got out 60 yards through the broken water, with the line paying out behind them, and 11 men holding it on the shingle. Damaris Frampton standing on the bank of stones with her hands in fists at her sides, heard the line go. She heard it before she saw it. Everybody on that beach saw it. She was the only person there who heard it first, and she said afterwards that it was the worst sound she ever heard in her life, and that it was not a crack and it was not a snap. It was a long, soft tearing, like a sheet, and it went on for the better part of a second, which is a very long time for a rope to be dying. 200 fathom of 4-inch line parted 11 yards out from the shore on a night when a strain came on it that it should have carried 3 times over, and it did not part all at once, and it did not part at a splice, and it did not part where it had been chafing on the pier. It came apart in the middle of a clear length, in the dark, and let 4 men go into a running sea in November. They got Gideon Trescott out at 11:15, 300 yards down the beach, alive, with the whole of the skin off both palms where the line had run through them and half his ribs black. And they got Hosea Legg's grandson out at midnight, alive. And they did not get Simeon Bragg, and they did not get Job Gollop. They got the crew of the Mary Vi off at 4 in the morning, at low water, over the stones, on a plank and a 15-fathom warp, and lost nobody, which everybody agreed afterwards was the cruelest part of the whole night, because it meant that if the line had held for another 11 minutes there, would not have been a single soul lost on that beach. Damaris Frampton sat on the shingle in the dark, with Gideon Trescott's head in her lap and her shawl round his hands, and the sea coming up the stones 11 feet away, and looked out at the lanterns, and heard Tabitha Gollop begin to call her grandson's name from somewhere along the beach, and went on hearing it, at intervals, for the rest of her life. The bodies came ashore on the 21st, 3 miles east, within an hour of one another. The inquest was opened on the 24th of November in the long room of the Bull by Dr. Pinney, coroner for the borough, and it sat for 2 hours, and it did one thing only, which was to establish that Simeon Bragg and Job Gollop had died of drowning in the sea off Bridport Harbour on the night of the 19th, and that they had done so in consequence of the parting of a line belonging to the harbour commissioners. Then Dr. Pinney said, in the flat way of a man who knows exactly what he is starting, and it will be for this jury, when we resume, to say why that line parted, and whose line it was. And I shall want the maker here. The room went very quiet. Captain Rendell stood up and said that the cordage in the shore crew's shed had been delivered on the 29th of September, under the tender of Mr. Ambrose Whittle of the Mead Works, and that the tender specified that the cordage should be of the making of the walk of the late Mr. Barnaby Frampton at Spittal, and should carry the maker's mark, and that the delivery had been signed for by his own clerk. Dr. Pinney wrote it down. And is that walk still at work? It is, said Captain Rendell. It is carried on by Miss Damaris Frampton. Then Miss Frampton will attend, said the coroner, and the inquest stands adjourned to the 9th of December. She walked home up North Street in the middle of the afternoon, with the whole town looking at her. It is a thing that happens fast, and it is worse than anybody who has not had it can imagine, and it does not need anybody to be cruel. Nobody threw anything. Nobody shouted at her, that week or any week. What happened was that a woman she had known all her life crossed to the other pavement outside the market house and looked in a window that had nothing in it. What happened was that a man touched his hat to her and then looked at his own hand as though it had insulted him. What happened was that on Thursday 2 of the 11 men did not come up the lane, and on Friday another, and on Saturday, when she opened the counting-house window to pay the wages, there were 6 standing in the yard, where there had been 11 and a boy, and none of them could look at her. And what happened was that on the 2nd of December she walked down South Street and knocked at Tabitha Gollop's door with 14 pounds in her hand, which was every loose shilling she had, and Mrs. Gollop opened it and stood there in her black, with her arms folded. "I've nothing to say to you, my dear," she said. "I've nothing to say to you at all. You go on home." "Mrs. Gollop," said Damaris, "it was not my rope." "Well," said Tabitha Gollop, "that's what I'd say too," and she shut the door, quite gently, which was much the worst way she could have done it. Ambrose Whittle behaved beautifully. That has to be said, because it is the whole of the man. He put 20 pounds into the subscription for the families on the first day, and let it be known that he had. He walked at both funerals. He gave out at the Bull, in the hearing of 9 gentlemen, that he would hear no word said against his sister-in-law, that she was a young woman of 24, who had been left a business she could not possibly manage, that the old gentleman's yard had been on its beam ends for 2 years before he died, and that when a walk is being carried on out of pure obstinacy by a girl who cannot spin, a yarn, with a stranger for a foreman and old men for spinners, then it is nobody's fault in particular if the work is not what it was in Barnaby Frampton's day. It is a misfortune, and the town should not be too hard on her. That was the sentence that killed her. Not an accusation. A defense. By the 2nd week of December there were 3 men and a boy on the books at Spittlewalk, and no orders, and 11 pounds in the tin. Gideon Trescott could not use his hands for a fortnight. She dressed them twice a day at the counting-house table, and the palms healed hard and white, in 2 long ridges across the roots of the fingers, and he never afterwards could feel a small thing with the pads of them, and would test a yarn with the back of his knuckle for the rest of his life. On the 4th of December he came into the counting-house and said, "I want to see the line. You want to see the line. There is 180 fathom of it in that shed still," said Gideon, "and 11 yards of it hanging off the grapnel somewhere on the beach, and there was 30 foot of it left in Israel Purchase's hands on the shingle that he never let go of, and he has it in his shed under a sack, because he did not know what else to do with it, and he was afraid to bring it up the lane." Damaris stood up so fast the stool went over. They went down to Israel Purchase's cottage in the dark with a lantern, and Israel brought it out from under the sack, and they laid it on his kitchen table, 29 feet of 4-inch rope, wet, sanded, with the broken end drawn out into a long, ugly brush of yarn like the tail of a horse. Gideon could not work his fingers, so he sat on one side of the table with the lantern and told her what to do, and Damaris Frampton did it. "Cut the seizing. No, further up, 6 foot from the break where it's sound. Now open the 3 strands. Get your thumb in and lift. It will fight you. Let it." The strands came open. "Now take the middle one. Count the yarns. 9 and 30, said Damaris. 9 and 30 in a 4-inch, said Gideon Trescott, is 117 in the rope. Mine would have been 144. Go on. Open that strand. Take it right down to the heart." She opened the strand out on the table in a fan of dark yarns, and separated them, and went through them one at a time, with the lantern pulled close. There was no red yarn in it, She did it again. She did it a third time. She unlaid another 6 feet at the far end, and did the whole of it again, all 3 strands, 117 yards, on a kitchen table in a fisherman's cottage at 11 o'clock at night, and there was no scarlet worsted anywhere in any part of it. Then she picked up a yarn and rolled it between her thumb and her forefinger, and she was quiet for a long moment. 8 turns, she said. 8 turns to the foot and not one more, and they have run it out fast and let the slack come, and there are hard spots in it every 4 or 5 fathom, which is a man spinning on a short walk and turning round too often. And it is not Petersburg. It is not even good Riga. It is short, and it is dusty, and it has been out in the wet before it was tarred, and whoever tarred it ran the copper too hot to hurry it and burnt the heart out of it, and the tar has gone into the outside of the strand and stopped there. She put the yarn down. Mr. Trescott, she said, that rope was 3 months old when it broke, and it was dead before it ever went in the water. Gideon Trescott sat looking at the fan of yarn on the table, with his bandaged hands on his knees. Now the ends, he said. They went down to the shed at the pier route the next morning, the 5th of December, and Captain Rendell came with them and unlocked it himself, and stood in the doorway with his back to the light. And Damaris Frampton knelt on the shingle floor and turned back the end of the great coil of 5-inch that had never been used, and looked at the last fathom of it. And there, worked into the outside of the middle strand, plainly visible, running 2 feet and no further and finished off under the whipping, was a thread of scarlet worsted. She sat back on her heels. Captain Rendell, she said, look at this and remember that you have looked at it. I am looking at it, said the harbour master. The mark of this walk is not on the outside of the strand, said Damaris. It is in the heart of the middle strand, and it runs the whole length of the rope from end to end, and it has been so since 1776, and it is entered in the rope house books at Plymouth Dock, and there are 172 sample hanks in my loft with it in them. Whoever laid this thread in did it in the last 2 feet, where a man would look, and he did it on the outside, where it can be seen. He knew there was a red thread. He did not know where it went. Captain Rendell did not say anything for a while. Then he said, Miss Frampton, on the 9th of December you will be asked by Dr. Pinney whether the line that broke on the beach was made at your walk, and I am going to give you a piece of advice that is worth more to you than anything else I own. Do not tell them any of this on the 9th. Damaris looked up at him. Why, because you have got no witness to it but yourself and a man you employ, said Captain Rendell, and because a coroner's jury will not follow it, and because the moment you say the word forgery in that room you will have told him what you have got, and he will have 3 months to get at it. Say you do not know. Ask for time, get your proofs into a strong room, and get somebody from outside this county who can swear to that mark, and then let it off in one piece where it cannot be put out. He was 70 years old, and he had commanded a brig of war for 11 years in the Channel, and he had watched Ambrose Whittle for 9. She took his advice. At the resumed inquest on the 9th of December, in a room with 140 people in it and every window shut, Damaris Frampton stood up in her mother's black gown and was asked by the coroner whether the line supplied to the commissioners in September had been made at Spittal Walk. I do not know, sir, she said. You do not know. I sold Mr. Whittle 30 fathom of 5-inch cable laid rope on the 28th of August, said Damaris, for £24 cash, and I have his clerk's receipt for it, and I entered it in my book. I sold him nothing else in the whole of that year. I received no order from him for the commissioner's work. I made no 4-inch line for anybody between the 1st of July and the 1st of October. Beyond that, I do not know what was in that shed, and I will not swear to something I have not been permitted to examine. Dr. Pinney looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. Do you ask to examine it? I do, said Damaris Frampton, and I ask that the whole of the cordage in that shed be sealed up by the commissioners this day, and not opened again, except before witnesses. There was a movement in the room. Ambrose Whittle stood up at the back, in the plumcoat, with his hat in his hand, and said, in a voice full of pain, that he had no objection in the world, that he wished it sealed, that he had bought in good faith from a walk he had been assured was equal to the work, and that he begged the jury to remember that his sister-in-law had been under a very great strain. The jury returned a verdict of accidental death, and added that in their opinion the line was insufficient for the work required of it. And that, thought everybody in the room, is the end of that. They broke into the loft on the night of the 11th of December. Reuben Slade woke at some time after 2, because the dog in the yard was going mad, and he came out of the tar house loft in his shirt, and saw the light in the Hank loft window, which was a light of the wrong color, and he shouted and ran. There were 2 of them, and they went over the north wall, and were gone up the hill in the dark before he had crossed the yard. They had come up the outside ladder and got the shutter off the loft window, and they had done the 2 things a man does when he is in a hurry and frightened. They had taken what was nearest and set fire to the rest. What was nearest was the pegs at the near end, which was the newest work, the last 11 years. What they set fire to was a pile of hanks pulled down into the middle of the floor, with a quart of lamp oil over them, on a board floor, in a loft, under a tarred roof, in a rope walk. Gideon Trescott put it out with 4 buckets of water and a wet sack and his own bandaged hands. And Reuben with the horse blanket. And Israel Purchase, who lived nearest, arrived in time to stamp out the edge of it against the chimney. They lost 41 hanks, the whole of the years from 1806 to 1817, burnt or taken. They did not lose the great book, because the great book was not in the loft. It had been in Mr. Hoskins' strong room in East Street since the 10th of December, which was 2 days before, on Captain Rendell's advice, and it had gone down the town in a fish basket under a cloth on Reuben Slade's shoulder at 7 in the morning, because Damaris had not liked to send it by cart. And they did not lose the years before 1806, because those hung at the dark end under the slope, 131 of them, and men in a hurry take what is by the window. Damaris Frampton stood in that loft at 3 in the morning in her cloak with the lantern, ankle deep in black water and burnt hemp, and looked at the 2 long rows of empty pegs at the near end. Then she said, "To nobody in particular, he has just told me that I am right." They never proved who it was. There was never the smallest chance of proving it, and she never afterwards said the name out loud in connection with that night, and there was a good deal of talk in the town, and Mr. Whittle offered a reward of £10 for the apprehension of the persons concerned, and it was never claimed. But on the morning of the 12th of December, in the wet ashes of the Hank loft, Damaris Frampton stopped being frightened, and everybody who dealt with her afterwards noticed the difference, and none of them could say what it was. That was the winter. There is not a great deal to be said about it. It was the hardest 3 months of her life, and she got through it the way people do get through such things, which is by dividing it into days. There was no work. She had 3 men and a boy, and she could not pay them past Christmas, and she told them so, and Zeb Loader said he had savings of £11, and would take his wages at Lady Day if there were any, and if there were not he would take the walk out in firewood, and Walter Chubb said much the same in worse language, and Israel Purchase, who had 6 children, said nothing at all and came up the lane every morning at 7 as usual. She braided. She went back to the room over the malt house in the 2nd week of January, and Mrs. Gollop was not there, and nobody spoke to her for 2 days, and on the 3rd day a woman named Sarah Vi, whose husband had been on the shingle that night holding the line, moved her stool 11 inches to make room, and said, "Without looking up, mind that draught, my dear. It comes in cruel by that shutter." And that was the beginning of the town coming back, and it took 9 weeks. She braided 80 of herring mesh a day, and got 1 and 3 for it, and put the whole of it in the tin, and went up the lane at 7 in the evening, and worked on the proofs until midnight by 1 candle, because that was the other thing she did that winter, and it was the thing that mattered. She had lost 41 sample Hanks. She had not lost the entries, because the great book was in a strong room in East Street. What she had lost was the proof that the entries were true, the actual rope in her hands, from the years that mattered. On the 14th of December, sitting at the counting-house table with the great book open and a sheet of paper, she wrote out a list of every customer named in those 11 burnt years. There were 68 of them, from Lyme to Abbotsbury and inland as far as Beaminster and Maiden Newton, and against each of them she wrote what she had sold and when. Then she put on her boots. What Damaris Frampton did that winter she never afterwards spoke about at any length, and it was not written down anywhere except in the little linen-bound book she kept for it, which is the reason it is known at all. She walked to every one of those 68 addresses. She walked to Hosea Legg's cottage at Chesil in a northeast wind on the 17th of December, and asked an old man whose grandson had been in that sea to let her cut 11 inches out of the seine warp she had sold him in 1814. She walked to Simonsbury and asked the Reverend Miss Chard to have his well rope drawn up, so that she might cut a foot off the top of it. She walked to Burton Bradstock, and to Ype, and to Loder's, and to Askerswell, and to Netherbury twice, because the first time the man was at Dorchester. She walked to Portland over the Fleet in January, and stood in the quarry office in the wind, and asked the quarrymaster, who had bought nothing from her uncle since 1815, and had thought poorly of him for years, to let her cut a sample from a crane rope of 1814 that was still, 3 years later, in daily use, and which the quarrymaster had privately been meaning to renew and had privately been putting off because it kept on not needing it. And at every one of those doors she did the same thing. She asked the owner to cut the piece himself, with his own knife, off his own rope, in his own yard. She asked him to unlay the middle strand of it, himself, down to the heart. with his own fingers, while she stood back with her hands behind her. And then she asked him what he found 61 times out of 68. A man or a woman standing in a yard or a boat or a lane in the middle of a Dorset winter opened a strand of rope with cold fingers and found a thread of scarlet worsted running through the heart of it, and looked up. Then she asked them to write on a slip of paper, in their own hand if they could write, and by their mark, and a witness if they could not, that this piece was cut by me from a rope bought of Frampton's of Spittal Walk in such and such a year, and that I opened it myself and found the red thread within, and the date, and the name. 61 slips. 61 pieces of rope, each tied to its slip with a bit of twine, each carried home in her basket, each entered in the linen book. She walked, by her own reckoning in that book, 311 miles between the 14th of December and the 20th of February. Some of it she did on the carrier's cart, when there was a carrier going her way and he would not take money. Most of it she did on her feet, in the wet, alone, in her mother's black gown, with a basket. And a thing happened while she was doing it that she had not planned and could not have planned. She went to 68 doors in that country, and stood on the step and explained herself, and at every door there was a man or a woman who had heard about the beach and about the Frampton girl and about the rope that broke, and had made up their mind about it, and had made it up in a hurry and comfortably, the way people do, and then they had to stand in their own yard with a bit of rope in their own hands and look at a red thread, and they had to think. The story went along that coast faster than she could walk it. By the end of January, she could not go into Burton Bradstock without somebody coming out of a house. By the middle of February, a Beaminster carrier, who had never bought a fathom of rope in his life, stopped his cart on the Bridport road and gave her a lift and would not be paid, and told her that his brother at Netherbury had cut a piece out of a haystack rope of 1809 and found the thread, and had it on the mantel-shelf, and showed it to everybody. On the 2nd of January she wrote a letter to Mr. Cobb, Master Ropemaker, His Majesty's Rope House, Plymouth Dock. It took 11 days to get an answer, and the answer was 4 pages long. She read it standing up in the yard, and then she sat down on the counting-house step in the rain, and read it again. Mr. Cobbet was 63, and had been at the dock since 1789, and he had known Barnaby Frampton by correspondence for 22 years, and had never once met him, and he wrote that he had been sorry to hear of his death, and sorrier to hear of what had followed. The mark of Frampton Spittal, Bridport, he wrote, is entered in the survey books of this yard under the year 1793, and again under the year 1800, and 6 upon the renewal of the contract. And the entry is in these words: 1 yarn of scarlet worsted laid in the heart of the middle strand, and continued throughout the length. I have myself surveyed and passed 19 deliveries from that walk, and I have myself opened the middle strand in every one of them, that being the manner of the survey, and I have never found it wanting. The books are the property of the Navy Board and cannot be moved, but an examined extract under the hand of the storekeeper may be had, and I will procure it, and I will come myself, at my own charge, if I am wanted, and I should take it as a favour to be asked, for I am on the half-pay of a discharged officer, and I have very little to do, and I did not like reading what I read in the Dorset paper. Damaris Frampton wrote back the same afternoon and asked him, on the 29th of January, at 4 in the afternoon. Ambrose Whittle came up the lane himself. He came alone and on foot, which he had never done in his life, and he came in an olive greatcoat instead of the plum, and he stood in the middle of the yard in the failing light with his hat in his hand, and asked whether he might come into the counting-house out of the cold. Damaris let him in. She did not ask him to sit down, and he sat down. He had a way of beginning that she had watched him use on other people for 4 years, which was to talk for 2 or 3 minutes about something else entirely. So that by the time he arrived at his business, you had already been agreeing with him about the weather and the state of the roads, and were out of the habit of saying no. He did it that afternoon about the price of hemp, and about a bridge at Loder's that was down, and about the health of Mr. Sprake. Then he said, I have come to make an end of it. Have you? Said Damaris. 300 pounds, said Ambrose Whittle, for the freehold, the walk, the yard, the store, the gear, and the stock as it stands, and I take Sprake's mortgage on my own back at midsummer, and I pay the whole of the burial subscription for both those families out of my own pocket, and let it be published that it is done at your desire. 300 pounds, Damaris, in a winter, when you have 3 men and a boy and no orders, and you are braiding in South Street for 1 and 3 a day, which I know, because there is nothing in this town that I do not know. And what becomes of the walk? Said Damaris. It is kept up, said Whittle. It is worked. It is put in hands that can carry it. And the loft. Ambrose Whittle looked at her steadily and did not blink. The loft, he said, is a burnt loft full of old rope, and it is worth nothing to anybody, and the sooner it is cleared and floored, the better. And I dare say that is a hard thing to hear about your uncle's leavings, but it is the truth, and somebody in this town ought to tell you the truth. Then he leaned forward a little, and the whole of the man came up to the surface for about 4 seconds, which was the only time she ever saw it happen. I would advise you to take it, he said, because you are going about the country with a basket, my dear, cutting bits off other people's ropes, and everybody is very sorry for you, and that lasts about a 12-month. And at the end of it you will be a woman of 25 with a burnt shed and a bad name and no husband and no trade, and there will not be 300 pounds on the table then, nor 3, nor 30. There is one bad hour in a person's life when the door is still open. This is yours. I am holding it. Damaris Frampton stood on the other side of that table with her hands quite still. Do not answer them, the old man had said, on the 3rd of February, with the wind coming up the walk. Not one word. Let them go on laughing until you have the thing in your hand, and then put it on the table where everybody can see it. She had, at that moment, 49 of the 61 pieces in a basket under the counting-house stairs, and a letter from Plymouth Dock in her pocket, and 19 more doors to knock at. Mr. Whittle, she said, it is nearly dark, and the lane is bad below the elms. I will lend you a lantern, if you will send the boy up with it in the morning. He sat looking at her for a moment. Then he stood up, and put his hat on, and took the lantern, and he said, at the door, in an ordinary voice with nothing in it at all, you were always the clever one, and Prudence was always the pretty one. And your uncle told me so at your father's funeral, and I have never liked either of you since. And he went down the lane with her lantern. He sent it back the next morning by a boy, with a shilling for the oil, because he was to the end a man who paid for small things. On the 9th of February, her sister came up the lane. Prudence Whittle had not been in that yard since 1814. She came at 11 in the morning in a good grey pelisse with a fur tippet, and she stood in the middle of the yard as though she did not know how to get any further into it, and Damaris came out of the counting house with her hands full of tally slips. They looked at each other. "I have brought you 11 pounds, said Prudence. "I do not want 11 pounds. "It is my own," said Prudence. "It is not his. It is out of the 20 that Uncle left me, and I have never spent it." Damaris said nothing. Prudence Whittle stood in the yard of her great-uncle's rope walk and looked down the length of the walk, and her mouth went out of shape. "I braided in that room over the malt house for 4 years," she said, "before I was married. I was not as quick as you. Nobody was ever as quick as you." Damaris. "They are saying in the town that you have been to 60 houses cutting bits out of people's ropes, and Ambrose laughed about it at his own table on Thursday in front of Mr. Pittard, and he said, 'She is going round the county with a basket like a gipsy poor creature.' And everybody laughed, and I sat there and I thought, she is not doing that, because she is mad. She has never done a thing in her life without a reason. She is doing that because she is going to be able to prove something." She stopped. "And then I thought," said Prudence, "what is it that she is going to prove?" Damaris put the tally slips down on the water butt. "Prudence," she said, "do not ask me that." "Why not?" "Because you will have to live in his house afterwards," said Damaris, "and because if you know it and say nothing, you will not forgive yourself, and if you know it and say something, he will know where it came from. Go home. Keep your 11 pounds. If I am wrong, you will have lost nothing, and if I am right, you will want it." Prudence Whittle stood there a moment longer. "He burnt your loft," she said. "I do not know that," said Damaris, "and neither do you, and we shall neither of us say it." "He came home at 4 in the morning on the 12th of December, said her sister, "and he had his boots off in the hall, and he sent Snell away at the door, and I have thought about it every day since, and I am not going to think about it any more." And she went away down the lane and left the 11 pounds on the water butt under a stone, and Damaris found it there an hour later. The special general meeting of the Bridport Harbour Commissioners was held in the long room of the Bull on Wednesday the 4th of March, 1818, at 11 in the forenoon. Mr. Ambrose Whittle had asked for it himself. That was the thing that afterwards nobody could quite believe, and it is the plainest proof of what a winter of being right in public will do to a man's judgment. His account was unpaid. 240 pounds of it stood over on the commissioner's books, because Captain Rendell had refused to certify the delivery, and every week that it stood over there was more talk, and the talk was no longer entirely going the way it had gone in November. So Ambrose Whittle wrote to the board and demanded that the whole matter be gone into publicly, that the cordage be examined by the board in open meeting, and that his character be cleared or damned, and he wrote it in the confidence of a man who has counted the money, and knows that his sister-in-law has nothing in the world but a burnt loft and a basket. The long room held 200 people that morning, and there were 300 in East Street. At the table sat the commissioners, 15 of them, with Captain Rendell at the end. Dr. Pinney the coroner sat at the side, not as coroner, but because he had said he would come. Mr. Hoskins sat behind Damaris, with his deed box on the floor at his feet. Mr. Ambrose Whittle sat at the front, on the right. in the plum coat, with Mr. Snell behind him and an attorney from Dorchester beside him. The sealed coils from the shore crew's shed stood in the middle of the floor on a tarpaulin, with the commissioner's seals on the lashings, exactly as they had been sealed on the 9th of December. And along the whole of the wall behind Damaris Frampton, brought up that morning in a handcart, pushed by Reuben Slade and Israel Purchase, stood 131 sample hanks on their beechwood tallies, in order of their numbers, from 1777 to 1805, and beside them on a trestle table, laid out in rows on a clean sheet, 61 short pieces of rope, each with a paper slip tied to it. The chairman asked Mr. Whittle to state his case. Ambrose Whittle stated it beautifully. He was on his feet 20 minutes. He said that he had tendered honestly, that he had bought the cordage in good faith of the walk named in his tender, that he had paid for it, that he had delivered it, that the maker's mark was on it, as the board could see for themselves the moment the seals were cut, that it was a very great grief to him that men had died, that the walk from which he had bought had been at that date in the hands of a young woman of 24, with no experience of manufacture and an unknown man for a foreman, that he had not liked to say so before out of family feeling, and that he asked no more than that the rope be opened in front of the town, and the red thread found, and his account paid. Then he sat down, and the room was entirely on his side, and Damaris Frampton got up. She had one sheet of paper in her hand, and she did not look at it once. I ask leave, she said, to have the 4-inch coil cut in 3 places, at one end and at the middle, and at 40 fathom from the far end. And I ask that it be cut by Mr. Whittle's own man, and not by mine. There was a stir at that. The chairman said it was a reasonable request. Mr. Snell, looking at nobody, went out and knelt by the coil and cut the seizing and cut the rope at the end, and at the middle, and at 40 fathom from the far end, with a knife somebody handed him, and the noise of the knife was the only noise in that room. Damaris Frampton said, "Mr. Trescott, if you please," and Gideon Trescott came forward with his white scarred hands and knelt down on the tarpaulin and began, very slowly, to unlay the middle strand of the end that had been cut from the finished end of the coil. The scarlet thread came out of it 2 feet long, and stopped. He held it up. There was a sound in the room like a wave going up shingle. "Now the middle," said Damaris. Gideon Trescott opened the middle strand of the piece cut from the middle of the coil, and laid the yarns out on the tarpaulin one at a time, 39 of them, and there was no scarlet in it. "Then the 40 fathom," said Damaris. 39 yarns, no scarlet. Nobody in the room said anything at all. Then Damaris Frampton turned round and looked at the wall of hanks behind her. "Gentlemen," she said, "there are 131 hanks against that wall, and they are the samples of 131 contracts taken by this walk between 1777 and 1805, and they hung on the pegs in my loft until the 11th of December, when 41 of their fellows, being all the years from 1806 to the present, were carried off and burnt by persons unknown. I ask any gentleman here, and I ask Mr. Whittle first, to come and take down any hank he chooses, of any year he chooses, and open the middle strand himself." The chairman said, "Mr. Whittle." Ambrose Whittle did not move. "Then I will," said Dr. Pinney, and got up and went to the wall and took down a hank, and unlaid it on the table in front of 200 people. and found the scarlet thread, and put it down, and took another, and found it, and took a third, and found it. And when he had done 3, he went on and did 9 more, going along the wall and taking them at random out of 5 different decades. And every time he found it, he laid the hank on the table with the thread pulled out and standing clear. And by the 12th, the room had begun very quietly to make a noise. And the 61, said Damaris Frampton. Mr. Hoskin read out the 61 slips, the name, the parish, the year of purchase, the words of the finding, the signature or the mark, and the witness. It took 19 minutes. Some of the names in that room belonged to men who were standing at the back of it, and as their names were read, 3 or 4 of them said, out loud from where they stood, "That's mine," and I cut it myself. And then Damaris Frampton said, "I ask that Mr. Cobb be called." Mr. Cobb of Plymouth Dock had come up on the Monday, and had been sitting quietly at the side of the room since 11 o'clock, with a leather case on his knees, and he got up, 63 years old, in a plain blue coat, and said who he was, and what he had been for 29 years, and produced an examined extract under the hand of the storekeeper of His Majesty's Rope House at Plymouth Dock, of the entry of the mark of Frampton, Spittal, Bridport, under the years 1793 and 1806, and read the words out. 1 yarn of scarlet worsted laid in the heart of the middle strand, and continued throughout the length. Then he put the paper down and looked at the coil on the tarpaulin, and said, "In the manner of a man who has surveyed cordage for the crown for 29 years, and has run out of patience with the whole world, and I will tell this board something else, since I am here. That rope was never made in a walk of 240 fathom. Look at the yarns. There is a join in every yarn in it at about 108 fathom, and another at about 216, and they run through the whole rope in a ring, which is what you get when a man spins on a short walk and has to join his yarn to reach his length. 108 fathom of clear yarn, and then a join. The walk that made this rope is about 110 fathom long. Miss Frampton's walk is 240, and there is not a join in any of those hanks on that wall, and any man here may look." Captain Rendell said, "Into the silence, the only walk of 110 fathom within 9 miles of this town is Tucker's, at the bottom of North Street, and it is held on a half share by Mr. Ambrose Whittle, and there has been a man spinning in it since April." Ambrose Whittle's attorney from Dorchester rose and said that his client had bought in good faith and could not be answerable for what a walk had put into its own rope. "Then let us have the order," said Captain Rendell. "The what, sir? The order," said Captain Rendell. "Mr. Whittle's tender says the cordage is of the making of the walk at Spittal, and that he has the buying of the same. Miss Frampton says she never received an order for it. Very well. Mr. Whittle keeps a day book and a letter book, like any man of business, and his clerk is behind him. Let us see the order, and the invoice for £460 of cordage, and the receipt for the money he paid her for it. It is 1 sheet of paper, Mr. Whittle. Send your man for it. We will wait. There is no such thing as a silence in a room of 200 people. There is only a change in the kind of noise, and the noise in the long room of the Bull changed at that moment in a way that everybody afterwards remembered and nobody could describe. Mr. Snell stood up. Ambrose Whittle said without turning his head, "Sit down." Mr. Snell did not sit down. He said to the table, in a voice that did not carry past the first 4 rows, and which the whole room therefore heard perfectly. "There ain't one, sir. There's a receipt for 30 fathom of 5 inch at £4.20 in August, and that's the whole of the account between the 2 houses in the year. And I wrote the certificate myself on the 29th of September at Mr. Whittle's. Dictation, and I put the red thread in the ends with my own hands out of a hank of worsted bought in this town for 7 pence. And I have not slept a whole night since the 19th of November. And I would sooner be transported than sit behind him 1 hour longer." It took the commissioners 11 minutes to pass 3 resolutions: that the account of Mr. Ambrose Whittle in the sum of £240 be not paid, and that the sum already paid on account be recovered; that the whole of the papers in the matter be laid before the magistrates; and that the board record its opinion that the cordage supplied to the shore crew under the tender of the 11th of August was not of the making of the walk at Spittal, that the mark upon it was counterfeit, and that Miss Damaris Frampton and the men of that walk left this room without the smallest stain upon them. The chairman asked Miss Frampton whether she had anything to say to the board. Damaris Frampton stood up. She was very white, and she had been standing or kneeling for 3 hours, and she had not eaten since the night before. "Yes," she said. "2 things. The first is that I want that 3rd resolution printed. Not in the paper, printed on a sheet, and posted at the market house and at the pier and in South Street, and I will pay for the printing, and I want it up by tomorrow noon. Because there is a woman in South Street who has not been able to say her grandson's name out loud since November, and I am not going to let her wait for the Dorchester paper on Friday." The chairman said it should be done, and the second, said Damaris, is this. The article says that cordage for the shore crew must be of the making of a walk that has held His Majesty's contract. And there is one such walk in this town, and it is mine. And after this morning nobody will tender against me. And I could name my own price for that shed at the pier route for the rest of my life. She stopped and put her hand flat on the table. "I will not be taking money for it," she said. "Not this year and not in 20 years. The shore crew's gear will come out of Spittal Walk, while there is a Spittal Walk. And it will be renewed every 3rd year whether it looks worn or not. And it will be 5-inch cable laid of Petersburg clean, double-tarred. And it will cost this board nothing. And there is one condition. Captain Rendell, or whoever sits in his chair after him, is to send for me, or for whoever sits in mine, on the 1st Monday of every March, and stand in that shed while every fathom of it is unlaid at the ends and looked at. And it is to be written down that it was done, because the whole of what has happened in this town since November happened, because there was rope in a shed that nobody ever looked at, and men are dead of it." She sat down. Mr. Hoskin then rose and said that with the board's leave he had a matter of his own to mention, which touched Mr. Whittle, and which he had had in his hands since the 11th of December, and had deliberately said nothing about until this morning, for a reason he would give. He opened his deed box and took out the great brown calf book. "When this book came into my strong room," he said, "the backboard was loose, as an old binding will be, and being a lawyer and therefore incurable, I looked inside it. There is a pocket in the board. Mr. Barnaby Frampton's father made a habit of it, and in the pocket there is this." He held up a folded skin, brown at the folds, with a seal on a tag. "Articles of agreement," said Mr. Hoskin, dated the 12th of May, 1802, between Barnaby Frampton of Spittlewalk, rope-maker of the one part, and Nathaniel Whittle of Bridport, hemp factor, father of the gentleman sitting there, of the other part. Whereby the said Barnaby Frampton demised unto the said Nathaniel Whittle the close of pasture called Coward's Mead, of 5 acres, and a rood lying below Spittlewalk, to hold for the term of 1 year, and so, from year to year, at the yearly rent of £4 10s, determinable by either party at Michaelmas, upon half a year's notice in writing. He let that sit for a moment. "It is not a conveyance," he said. "It is a tenancy from year to year. The freehold of Coward's Mead never left the Frampton family. It was never sold, and it passed under the will of the 7th of last September, with the rest, to Miss Damaris Frampton. The rent of £4 10 has been paid every Michaelmas for 16 years, latterly by Mr. Ambrose Whittle himself, who has, I have no doubt, been told all his life that it was a chief rent on his own land, as his father was careful that he should be told." The Dorchester attorney was on his feet. "What," he said, "is on that land?" "The mead works," said Mr. Hoskin. "The counting house, the braiding shed, the tar house, the store, the drying ground, the racks, and the whole of it, built between 1804 and 1812 upon a yearly tenancy, by a man who never once asked to see his own father's title." "And that," said Mr. Hoskin, "is why I have said nothing about it for 3 months. Because if I had produced it in January, every man in this room would have said that Miss Frampton had gone hunting through an old book for a stick to beat her sister's husband with. She did not know of it until 8 o'clock this morning, when I told her on the stairs of this house, and she asked me to say nothing until the board had decided the other matter on its own merits. It has decided. I am now at liberty." Ambrose Whittle sat perfectly still in the plum coat and looked at nothing at all. He was committed by the magistrates on the 11th of March, tried at the Dorchester Assizes in July on an indictment for obtaining money by false pretenses, convicted in 50 minutes, fined £200 and imprisoned in Dorchester gaol for 12 calendar months. Snell was indicted with him, pleaded guilty, gave his evidence, and was fined a shilling and discharged with a homily from the judge about the sort of courage that comes 11 weeks late. And he left the county and went to Bristol, and was, as far as anybody at Bridport ever knew, an honest man for the rest of his life. The half-share in Tucker's Walk was sold to pay the fine. The mead works stood on Coward's Mead. Damaris Frampton gave notice to quit on the 24th of March, 1818, expiring at Michaelmas in a letter of 4 lines drafted by Mr. Hoskin, and on the 5th of April she went down to the mead works, and stood in the middle of the braiding shed, where 40 women sat at their nets with their needles stopped and their faces turned to her, and made them an offer. She said, "At Michaelmas this ground comes to me. I am not going to pull anything down, and I am not going to put one of you out. Every woman here is on my books from Michaelmas at the same work, and a farthing more the score, and there are 3 of you owed back money, and I have the account, and it will be paid. The 11 men in the yard are on my books too, and Mr. Trescott will see them on Monday. The nets go on being made here, because this is where the braiders live, and it was a foolishness of my uncle's ever to let it go. And the counting house is going to be turned into a room with a stove in it where you can eat your dinner out of the wind, which I have wanted for 11 years and never once had." Then she said, "And I will tell you the other thing, because you will hear it wrong if you hear it from anybody else. Mrs. Whittle is my sister. Whatever is done to him and not to her. She keeps her house. Nobody in this shed is to be uncivil to her in the street, and if I hear of it I shall know who did it. Because I sat in that corner by the shutter for 11 years, and there is nothing said in a braiding room that I do not know about by Friday." Prudence Whittle came to live at Spittlewalk in the August of that year, and stayed 9 months, and went home to her husband when he came out of Dorchester Gaol in July of 1819, which surprised a good many people, and did not surprise her sister at all. They lived quietly in a small house at Allington on an annuity of £80 that Damaris settled on her sister for her own life, out of her own money. And Ambrose Whittle never worked again in the cordage trade, nor in any trade, and was never once mentioned at Spittlewalk by anybody, which was in the end the harshest thing that could have happened to him. The printed sheet went up at the market house at 11 on the 5th of March. Damaris did not go and look at it. She went to South Street with a piece of rope in her pocket. Tabitha Gollop opened the door and stood there in her black, and Damaris did not say anything at all. She took out the piece of rope, which was 11 inches of 2.5-inch line, and she put it into the old woman's hands, and she opened the middle strand herself with her thumb, and drew out the scarlet thread, and held it up between them in the doorway. "That is out of the seine warp your husband bought of my uncle in 1804, she said, "and it is in every fathom that ever came out of my gate, and it was not in the rope that was on the beach." Tabitha Gollop looked at the red thread for a long time. Then she said, "I knowed it, my dear. I knowed it on the 11th of December when I heard about your loft. I knowed it, and I still couldn't come up that lane, and I've been ashamed of myself since, and I'll be ashamed of myself when I'm dead." "Come up it now," said Damaris. Mrs. Gollop was in the braiding room over the counting house at Spittlewalk at 6 o'clock the next morning, and she was there every working morning for 9 more years, and she was forewoman of it from 1820 until she died in 1827. The first rope laid at Spittlewalk after the 4th of March was 200 fathom of 5-inch cable laid, Petersburg clean, double tarred, lay 11 inches, for the shore cruise shed at Bridport Harbour at no charge, and the entry in the Great Book, in Damaris Frampton's hand, reads, Number 173. For the shore crew, not to be sold, not to be lent, and to be looked at every March. Sample hank hung. Red yarn in heart of middle strand. This one is for Job Gollop, aged 18, of South Street, and for Simeon Bragg of Chesil, and there is nothing else that can be done for them. The orders came in that spring the way water comes through a broken hatch. The Portland quarrymasters came first, on the 17th of March, and ordered 600 fathom of 2.5-inch crane rope, double tarred, at her price, without a word said about the price. The commissioners renewed the warping gear. Poole sent. Lime sent. A Bristol house that had never heard of Bridport wrote in April, because a quarrymaster had told a shipowner in an inn. In the first week of May, she took an order for 1,100 fathom of assorted cordage for a Newfoundland house, and had to write and ask for 6 weeks' grace, because she had not the men. By midsummer, 1818, there were 29 men and a boy on the walk, and 42 women in the braiding shed at the mead. And she paid off the whole of Mr. Sprake's £340 on the day it fell due, and took the deed of the hemp store out of his hands, and carried it home in her basket. Mr. Cobb came back in June and never left. He took a cottage in North Street, and he surveyed for her, and he taught Reuben Slade the whole of the survey of cordage, as it was done in the King's yards. And he sat in the counting-house on winter afternoons with the great book, and argued with her about the Navy's manner of reckoning tarred weight, and he lived to 81. It was the 14th of May when Gideon Trescott asked her, and he did it at the far end of the walk, because he had thought about it a good deal, and that was where he wanted to be standing. It was 7 in the evening, and the sun was in the west door, and the whole quarter of a mile lay in one long yellow bar with the dust standing in it, and the swallows going in and out. He said, "There's a thing I've been carrying since October, and I've had the winter to think better of it, and I have not thought better of it." Damaris Frampton stood with her back against the post at the far end, the crooked one that nobody had ever mended. "Then say it," she said. "I have 12 shillings a week and a share in writing since Lady Day," said Gideon Trescott, "and a loft over a tar house, and 2 hands that can't feel a small thing any more, and I am 32, and I have no family living, and nothing at all to recommend me, except that I know what you are, which is more than this county did until March." He put his hand in his pocket. "I have not got a ring," he said. "I have got this." It was 11 inches of scarlet worsted yarn, out of the heart of the middle strand of the first rope she ever laid herself, hank number 172, which had burnt on the 11th of December, and out of which he had pulled the thread and kept it in his pocketbook from that night to this. Damaris Frampton looked at it lying across his scarred palm. Then she held out her left hand. He wound it round her finger 3 times and tied it, because his fingers were no good for anything finer than that, and it took him some while, and she stood and let him do it and did not help him. "There," he said. "It will not last a fortnight," said Damaris. "No," he said, "it never does. That's not what it's for. It's for whoever comes to open it up afterwards." They were married at St. Mary's at the bottom of the town on the 9th of July, 1818, by the Reverend Mr. Yeatman, 3 days before Ambrose Whittle stood his trial at Dorchester, which nobody in the wedding party mentioned. Zeb Loder gave her away, because there was nobody else, and because he had been in that yard since 1766. The whole of the braiding shed came. Hosea Legg came, and the quarrymaster came 13 miles from Portland, and Mr. Cobb came from North Street, and Captain Rendell read the lesson, and Mrs. Gollop cried from the beginning to the end, and said afterwards that she had not been crying about the wedding. Frampton and Trescott, rope makers of Spittle Walk, Bridport, took a Navy Board contract again in 1826, and held one continuously from 1831 to 1864. They roofed the whole of Coward's Mead in 1829. They put up the second walk of 280 fathom in 1834, and the steam engine in 1841, and Damaris Trescott fought the engine for 3 years and lost, and said publicly at the opening of it that a machine could spin a yarn 11 turns to the foot all day and never once know why it mattered, and then went home and read the maker's book on it twice. Reuben Slade was taken into the firm in 1839. Israel Purchase's second son was foreman of the laying floor for 21 years. Walter Chubb kept the copper until 1833 and would let nobody else near it. They had 4 children. The eldest, a girl, could tell the turns in a yarn between her thumb and finger at 9 years old, and her mother tested her the way Barnaby Frampton had tested her, and then went out into the yard and stood by herself for a while. And every rope that ever went out of that gate, under all 3 of the names it carried in that century, had 1 yarn of scarlet worsted laid in the heart of the middle strand, and continued throughout the length, and the sample hanks went on being hung on the pegs. And the numbers went past 1,000 in 1847, and past 3,000 in 1861, and the entry against every one of them was written in the same 7 words that Barnaby Frampton's father had written on the 9th of April, 1777, and that his great-great-granddaughter was still writing in her own hand at 72 years of age. Damaris Trescott died at Spittal Walk in the March of 1865, in the room over the counting house, with the little window open that looks down the length of the walk, and she was buried at St. Mary's beside her husband, who had gone 11 months before her. The town shut for it. Every walk in Bridport stopped its whirls at noon, which had not been done for anybody since her great-uncle. There is a stone, and it has her name on it and the dates, and under that, at her own particular direction, written out in her own hand in a letter to Mrs. Hoskins' son in 1863, there are 7 words, and they are not a text, and they are not a verse, and every rope-maker between Lyme and Abbotsbury knew exactly what they meant and where they came from, and so did every soul in that town who had been old enough in 1817 to stand in the parlor of the Greyhound after a funeral, and hear a man in a plum-colored coat say, with his back half turned, that she had been left 1/4 mile of grass and a shed with a hole in the roof. The 7 words are these: red yarn in heart of middle strand,